Pope Francis has been criticised as being allegedly naive in rejecting traditional just war criteria that allowed for a war of defence against an unjust aggressor. Do you think this is a valid criticism of Pope Francis' views?
Yes, that's a view that's been taken by some critics, particularly from the right wing or political wing. I don't think it's a fair criticism. Certainly, Pope Francis is making a very strong statement about the threat of war and the impact of new wars today because of the massive, particularly nuclear weapons, but also there's a huge range of new weapons coming onto the market, far more sophisticated robotic weapons, and much more devastating. And he says, war is no ghost from the past, but it's a constant threat. And he notes that since the Second World War, we seem to have been and there have been constantly wars going on. Now, he does not reject out of hand the traditional just war criteria. What he is distressed about is the just war criteria are continually manipulated to justify recent wars, including undoubtedly the Iraq War, which Pope John Paul II so vigorously opposed, and the appalling consequences are still ongoing from that war. So Francis, he doesn't rule out the need altogether to defend the innocent, of course, against unjust attack. But he wants to maximise the moral pressure about deciding to go for war and avoiding wars of choice that we have been involved in recent times. He writes, in recent decades, every single war has been ostensibly, quote, justified. Some would also wrongly justify even preventive attacks or acts of war. Well, Iraq was one of those, wasn't it, the war in Iraq? These can hardly avoid entailing evils and disorder greater than the evil to be eliminated. We can no longer think of war as a solution because its risks will probably, I emphasize that word probably, always be greater than its supposed benefits. He doesn't say they're always going to be greater, but he says probably. And in view of this, he says, it is very difficult nowadays to invoke the rational criteria elaborated in earlier centuries to speak of the possibility of a just war. And then he adds, never again war. And particularly in this global era, he writes that wars have long and unexpected consequences that end up harming the entire planet and opening the way to new and worse wars in the future. He says we experience a world war fought piecemeal, here and there, breaking out here and there, all over the place. And what he does is that he invites all of us to think of war in personal terms, the personal consequences of war, and to empathise with the victims on all sides. And here's a little quote for you. Every war leaves our world worse than it was before. War is a failure of politics and of humanity, a shameful capitulation, a stinging defeat before the forces of evil. Let us not remain mired in theoretical discussions, but touch the wounded flesh of the victims. Let us hear the true stories of these victims of violence, look at reality through their eyes, and listen with an open heart to the stories they tell. In this way, we'll be able to grasp the abyss of evil at the heart of war. Nor will it trouble us to be deemed naive for choosing peace. And I can think of not only the victims of war, but we even think of our soldiers returning from war. You know, in the Second World War, all the people who came back to First World War again, traumatized and by the whole experience, terrible experience of war, what it does, and they're the victors of the war. What does it do to those who are conquered, and particularly the innocent, the men, women and children who are killed innocently. And then he fears the catastrophic consequences of nuclear war. He rejects deterrence policy as a basis for a lasting peace, words carefully chosen. Here, he quote, the ultimate goal of the total elimination of nuclear weapons both becomes a challenge and a moral and humanitarian imperative. He's also appalled by the waste and corruption involved in the arms trade and pleads that the money spent on arms be used to establish a global fund that can finally put an end to hunger and favour development in the most impoverished countries, so that citizens do not have to resort to violent or illusory solutions or have to leave their countries in order to seek a more dignified life. So this, again, the idea of a global fund is an idea put forward by Paul VI many years ago. And if only we'd been able to transfer some of the massive funding we put into arms into development efforts, sustained development efforts over those years, what a different world it would be now. But still not too late, he said, we can still do this. A couple of other things he mentions on the death penalty. He's really supported John Paul II again against the use of the death penalty, saying that there can be no stepping back from this position. Today we state clearly that the death penalty is inadmissible, and the Church is firmly committed to calling for its abolition worldwide. So this is a struggle we had, or a political issue in Australia 40, 50 years ago. And it's still going on in the United States and many countries. And he goes on, he says, particularly serious in this regard is the so-called extrajudicial killing. And we can think of the Philippines, where thousands of people have been killed like this, where homicides are deliberately committed. He wrote that everyone of goodwill is called to work against this and the use of the death penalty, and to improve prison conditions. You look at photos of prison conditions in the Philippines and you're just aghast at this. He considers even life imprisonment as a form of the death penalty. So he's calling us in this section, it's an impassioned section of his writing about, you know, we must avert this trajectory or on to greater, wider wars, because it will undermine our whole effort of human uplift.